Welcome. Today, we're going to unpack how historical deficit spending predictably forced long-term institutional changes, and more importantly, exactly what that means for macroeconomic strategy today. Look, if you're a policymaker focused on long-term fiscal stability, or honestly just someone fascinated by how nations actually build real, enduring power, you are in exactly the right place. Because the historical lessons we're about to explore, they aren't just academic curiosities. They are the literal blueprints for modern statecraft and survival. So, let's dive right into a massive historical puzzle, aimed directly at those of you balancing modern national budgets. Just picture this. How did England manage to become an absolute global superpower by the close of the 18th century? Keep in mind, at the time, this was a geographically limited island nation. They had a small population and very few natural resources, especially when you compare them to massive continental rivals like France. Achieving global dominance from that starting position seems, well, almost impossible without some kind of fiscal magic trick. To understand how they actually pulled it off, we have to look past the battlefield and peer directly into the national treasury.
Okay, here is our briefing roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, the state-building debate. Then 2, war, debt, and taxes. Next up is 3, visualizing the ratchet effect. Followed by 4, wars that forged institutions. And we'll wrap up with number 5, lessons for modern policymakers.
Let's get right into section 1, the state-building debate. To solve our initial puzzle, we first have to look at two dueling academic theories about how empires and their underlying infrastructural powers are actually built. In one corner, we have theory A from John Brewer. He argued that increases in taxing capacity best explain how early modern England built its state. Essentially, he believed that citizens bearing the immediate burden of taxes drove the whole engine of success. But then, in the other corner, theory B from P.M. Dixon takes a wildly different approach. Dixon argued it was actually a system of heavy public borrowing that allowed England to spend out of all proportion to its actual tax revenue. The core debate boils down to this. Was it immediate taxation that laid the foundation for the English state, or was it their brilliant ability to leverage future promises through debt?
You know, the Roman statesman Cicero once noted that the sinews of war are infinite money. But here's the reality. Taxing a population with finite resources is naturally limiting. In fact, if you squeeze your citizens too hard, too fast, it usually leads directly to a revolt. But England, they managed to simulate this infinite money cheat code through a financial revolution. They used public debt as the ultimate political pressure valve. Instead of bleeding their populace dry with immediate taxes, they borrowed. So how exactly did that mechanism work in practice?
That brings us to section 2, war, debt, and taxes. Let's look at the actual statistical data that settles this historical debate once and for all.
When we look at the data from 1689 to 1789, it reveals a very precise, undeniable causal chain. When a war starts, we actually do not see taxes immediately rising. Instead, we see this distinct three-part sequence. Step 1, boom. A war brings unexpected, massive fiscal shocks. Step 2, the state relies on its credit to borrow heavily, creating an immense debt burden just to survive the crisis. And finally, step 3, taxes are eventually increased later. Crucially though, they aren't increased to pay for the war itself. They're increased simply to pay the interest on that growing mountain of debt.
And when we really dive into the math, we find a literal mathematical smoking gun. The source data reveals a staggering 0.96 correlation between total debt and total taxes. Now, for anyone not steeped in statistics, a 0.96 correlation means these two factors move almost in absolute lockstep. It's practically a perfect mirror. It proves undeniably that debt, not war itself, is the most robust, direct indicator of future changes in taxation. Debt predicts taxes. This firmly validates Dixon's theory that public borrowing was the true engine driving the growth of state infrastructure.
Moving on to section 3, visualizing the ratchet effect.
Now that we understand the sequence, we need to observe how this dynamic behaves over decades of nearly continuous conflict. The contrast between peacetime and wartime behavior is just stark. During times of peace, the state practically ignored its debt. They made only minimal, half-hearted efforts to repay what they owed. But the absolute second an outbreak of war occurred, we see explosive, undeniable spikes in the level of public debt, increasing in over 70% of the historical observations. War reliably and repeatedly triggered massive borrowing. For those of you analyzing long-term macroeconomic trends, this perfectly illustrates what we call the ratchet effect. The debt-to-GDP ratio dramatically climbs during every major conflict. But here is the catch.
it never truly resets to zero when peace returns. The debt stays elevated. To service this permanent financial weight, the state was forced to build a much more robust civil government capable of extracting larger shares of the country's economic capacity. They did this by creating permanent tax bureaucracies that never disbanded once the cannon stopped firing. The state machinery ratchets up, and it stays up permanently.
Let's ground these regression models in some actual history. In Section 4, Wars that Forged Institutions.
Consider the sheer scale of the deficits required to survive these 18th century conflicts. During the 9 Years' War, the deficit was already sitting at 50% of revenue. But by the time we reached the 7 Years' War, the expenditures didn't just exceed tax revenues, they more than doubled them. Deficit spending hit 109% of revenue, leaving an absolutely staggering debt of £132.6 million at the war's end. Running immense deficits of this magnitude required total reliance on British savings. Borrowing wasn't a choice, it was an existential necessity.
The source text actually provides a brilliant summary of this entire phenomenon. It says, England may have purchased its 19th century global dominance on its 18th century credit card. I love that phrasing. It is incredible to realize that an entire empire's survival, military mobilization, and eventual global expansion relied almost entirely on the flexibility of credit. They successfully secured global dominance for tomorrow with the absolute ironclad promise that they would build the extractive tax capacity to pay for it today.
Finally, let's bring it all back home with Section 5, Lessons for Modern Policymakers.
Let's extract the ultimate lesson in fiscal stability from the 18th century and apply it to modern macroeconomics. Look, borrowing provides the illusion of infinite money and allows for rapid mobilization during a crisis. Yes, deficit spending acts as a shield. It protects your citizens from immediate, crushing tax shocks. But to avoid default, a state must inevitably build a massive, long-term tax infrastructure to service that debt. For any modern policymaker, this is the harsh reality check. Deficit spending is the shield, but a permanent tax infrastructure is the heavy sword you will eventually have to carry. Crisis spending permanently expands the size and reach of the state. You can borrow to survive the immediate shock, but institutional survival dictates that you must ultimately muster the painful political will to tax.
The political philosopher Thomas Paine perfectly synthesized what the mathematical data just proved. He wrote, "War has but one certain, and that is to increase taxes." And honestly, whether you are funding an overseas conflict, massive internal improvements, or wide-scale social welfare programs, the rule holds true. Extraordinary debt-fueled expenditures always result in a permanent, undeniable expansion of the state's extractive reach.
So as you look at today's national budgets, you really have to ask yourself a critical question based on this data. Are we using our modern credit to build lasting, effective infrastructural capabilities, or are we simply waiting for the inevitable tax ratchet to catch up with us? It's a question every informed leader must confront. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the historical data gives you a sharp, new lens for viewing modern fiscal strategy.